21.3 The Uses and Limitations of Real GDP. In this chapter, we study the standard of living over years, over time, tracking the course of the business cycle, the standard of living among countries, goods and services omitted from GDP, other influences on the standard of living. We use estimates of real GDP for three main purposes: to compare the standard of living, to track the course of the business cycle, to compare the standard of living among countries. The standard of living over time. The nation's standard of living is measured by the value of goods and services that its people enjoy on average. Income per person determines what people can afford to buy, and real GDP is a measure of the real income. So, real GDP per person or real GDP divided by the population is a commonly used measure for comparing the standard of living over time. By using real GDP, we remove any influence that rising prices and a rising cost of living might have had on our comparison. A handy way of comparing real GDP per person over time is to express it as a ratio of its value in some reference year. Table provides the numbers for the United States that compare 2013 with 53 years earlier, 1960. In 1960, real GDP per person was $17,212, and in 2013 it was $49,639, or 2.9 times 1960 level. To the extent that real GDP per person measures the standard of living, people were 2.9 times as well off in 2013 as their grandparents had been in 1960. Figure shows the entire 53 years of real GDP per person from 1960 to 2013 and displays two features of the changing standard of living: the growth of potential GDP per person, fluctuations of real GDP per person around potential GDP. Potential GDP is the level of real GDP when all the economy's factors of production, labor, capital, land, and entrepreneurial ability are fully employed. When some factors of production are unemployed, real GDP is below potential GDP. And some of the factors are overemployed and working harder and for longer than can be maintained in the long run, real GDP exceeds potential GDP. To measure the trend in the standard of living, we must remove the influence of short-term fluctuations and focus on the path of potential GDP. The growth rate of potential GDP fluctuates less than the growth rate of real GDP. During the 1960s, potential GDP per person grew at an average rate of 2.8% a year. But since 1970, its growth rate has slowed to 1.9% a year. This growth slowdown means that potential GDP is lower today, and lower by a large amount than it would have been if the 1960s pace. Potential GDP per person 2013 would have been $30,000 more than it actually was. The cumulatively lost income from the growth slowdown of the 1970s is a staggering $406,000 per person. Understanding the reasons for the growth slowdown is one of the major tasks of macroeconomists. Tracking the course of the business cycle is the second use of calculating GDP. We call the fluctuations in the pace of economic activity the business cycle. A business cycle is a periodic but irregular up and down movement of total production and other measures of economic activities such as employment and income. The business cycle isn't regular, predictable, and recycling cycle like the phase of the moon. The timing and the intensity of the business cycle vary a lot, but every cycle has two phases: expansion, recession, and two turning points, peak and trough. This is the picture of a business cycle I have shared with you all. An expansion is a period during which real GDP increases. In the early stage of expansion, real GDP remains below potential GDP. That means all the resources are not fully employed. And as the expansion progresses, real GDP eventually exceeds potential GDP. A recession is a period during which real GDP decreases, its growth rate is negative for at least two successive quarters. An expansion ends and a recession begins at a business cycle peak. Peak is the highest level of real GDP that has been attained up to that time. A recession ends at a trough when real GDP reaches a low point and from which a new expansion begins. So these are the phases of business cycle and the relationship between real GDP and potential GDP. The shaded bar in figure highlights the 2008-2009 recession. This recession was unusually severe. It lowered real GDP to its 2005 level. The end of recession isn't the end of pain. When the expansion begins, real GDP is below potential GDP, and even after 2 years into the expansion that followed the 2008-2009 recession, real GDP had not returned to its previous peak level, and the gap between real GDP and potential GDP was wide. The period that began in 1991 following a severe recession and that ended with the global financial crisis of 2008 was so free from serious downtowns in the real GDP and other indicators of economic activity that it was called the Great Moderation, a name that contrasted with the Great Depression. Some starry-eyed optimists even began to declare that the business cycle was dead. This long period of expansion also turned the attention of macroeconomists away from the business cycle and toward a focus on economic growth and the possibilities of achieving faster growth. The standard of living among countries. To use real GDP per person to compare the standard of living among countries, we must convert the numbers for other countries into US dollars. To calculate real GDP, we must also use a common set of prices called purchasing power parity prices for all countries. The International Monetary Fund performs these calculations. They tell, for example, that an average American has a standard of living income per person almost 6 times that of an average person in China. Real GDP provides an easy way of comparing living standards, but real GDP does not include all the goods and services produced. Also, real GDP has nothing to say about factors other than the goods and services that affect the standard of living. Goods and services omitted from GDP. GDP measures the value of goods and services that are brought in markets. GDP excludes household production, underground production, leisure time, environment quality. Household production. Household production is the production of goods and services, mainly services in the home. Examples of this production are preparing meals, changing a light bulb, cutting grass, washing a car, and helping a student with homework. Because we don't buy these services in markets, they are not counted as part of GDP. The result is that GDP underestimates the value of the production. Many items that were traditionally produced at home are now brought in the market. For example, more families now eat in fast food restaurants, one of the fastest growing industries in the United States, and use daycare services. These trends mean that food preparation and childcare services that were once part of household production are now measured as part of the GDP. So real GDP grows more rapidly than does real GDP plus home production. Underground production. Underground production is the production of goods and services hidden from the view of government because people want to avoid taxes and regulations or their actions are illegal. Because underground production is unreported, it is omitted from GDP. Examples of underground production are the distribution of illegal drugs, farm work that uses illegal workers who are paid less than minimum wage, and jobs that are done for cash to avoid paying income taxes. This last category might be quite large and includes tips earned by cab drivers, hairdressers, and hotel and restaurant workers. Edgar L. Feige, an economist at the University of Wisconsin, estimates that US underground production was about 16% of GDP during the early 1990s. Underground production was about 16% of GDP during the early 1990s. Production in many countries, especially in the most developing countries, is estimated to be larger than in the United States. Leisure time. Leisure time is an economic good that is not valued as part of GDP. At the marginal hour of leisure time, must be at least as valuable to us as the wage we earn for working. If it were not, we would work instead. Over the years, leisure time has steadily increased as the work week gets shorter. More people take early retirement and the number of vacation days increases. These improvements in our standard of living are not measured in real GDP. Environment quality. Pollution is an economic bad, that is, opposition of a good. The more we pollute our environment, the other things remaining the same, the lower is our standard of living. This lowering of our standard of living is not measured by real GDP. Other influences on the standard of living. The quantity of goods and services consumed is a major influence on the standard of living, but other influences are health and life expectancy, political freedom and social justice. Health and life expectancy. Good health and a long life, the hopes of everyone, do not show up directly in real GDP. The higher real GDP enables us to spend more on medical research, healthcare, a good diet, and exercise equipment. As real GDP has increased, our life expectancy has lengthened. But we face new health and life expectancy problems every year. Diseases such as AIDS and drug abuse are taking young lives at a rate that causes serious concern. When we take these negative influences into account, real GDP growth might overstate the improvements in the standard of living. Political freedom and social justice. A country might have a very large real GDP per person but have limited political freedom and social justice. For example, a small elite might enjoy political liberty and extreme wealth while the majority of people have limited freedom and live in poverty. Such an economy would generally be regarded as having a lower standard of living than one that had the same amount of real GDP but in which everyone enjoyed political freedom.